Okay, I'm going to go ahead and get started. I've got 2:30. I'm Dr. Michael. I'm the building principal at Rogers New Technology High School. With me today is one of my academic facilitators, Mr. Todd Sisson. Todd is basically our instructional coach who also teaches a period for us. And so we're going to kind of do this in tandem. And as I said earlier, the goal for us today is that we're drawing a thread through all of this. And so Todd and I are going to give you some information about how you might be able to do in your classroom or in your building some of the things that we talked about at lunchtime. And then immediately after this, I think in this same room, we brought some of our learners, and it's really just an open kind of question and answer session based on topics that are questions that those folks might have as far as what's the student or what's the learner perspective in all this. And so I told you earlier I'm a big fan of Simon Sinek, and so I think it's always important to talk about what we believe because right from the get-go we should have an understanding of are we after the same things, right? I think that's important. So anytime that we have these conversations with our faculty, we always kind of start out, or we remind ourselves, what do we believe? I bring it up in our conversations. We use that terminology a lot. I believe this, I believe that. And so in our model, we believe that we're really looking at this where we're developing an understanding of the content. At the same time, we're building skills with kids, right? They are co-equal. So we might teach biology, but in essence, what we say, what we're doing is we're teaching, and you'll see this, we'll use this term, we're teaching agency skills. We're teaching collaboration. We're teaching oral communication in my classroom, and my classroom happens to be, biology or chemistry or American history or whatever that looks like, right? Because what are we doing? We're turning 14-year-olds into adults. Okay, that's our mission. That's what we're trying to do. And so I just kind of tried to bring in a few things. We believe that as an equal partner, you have to teach, assess, you have to give feedback on the identified skills. So if you're going to tell kids, if you have a mission of, we're going to teach, I'll take a big one from high school, we teach responsibility. Right? How do we teach responsibility? Well, when I started, we taught responsibility by telling them, you turn that paper in on Friday, it doesn't come in on Friday, I'm going to give you a 0 or half credit or whatever. Right? But I would argue at this point, knowing what I know, it's not teaching responsibility, it's assessing responsibility. Right? How do we teach responsibility to a kid who doesn't have it? That's our question. How do I scaffold for a kiddo who doesn't yet have the skill to be responsible? How do I scaffold to help teach them responsibility or personal relevance or what you fill in the blank? And we'll kind of talk a little bit about that. We also believe in the power of rubrics. Everything we do in our building is rubric based. We're going to, and we'll kind of take you through what that looks like, but we're going to have a rubric for agency. We're going to have a rubric for oral communication. We're going to have a rubric for collaboration. And then we're going to tell kids, this is the skill set you're working on. So we're going to give you feedback on how well you shared the air, for instance. Okay, and we'll kind of take you through what that looks like. But again, we believe, which means we're using every day in all classrooms, rubrics, and then we believe that students are going to learn more deeply when they are owners of their own learning. Okay? And one of the things that, if I don't come back to it, hopefully you might ask me some questions. Do I have any building principals here? I know Patrick. Okay, fantastic. In my world, this doesn't just happen inside the classroom. Right? This happens in the hallways. This happens at lunch. This happens where they are owners of the process, which means we as building principals have to allow kids to make some decisions. Right? We have to allow them to say, hey, I got this idea, or hey, we want to wear hats in the building. That was the first thing I did. Kids said, we want to wear hats in the building. Fine, I don't have a problem with it. Well, it's disrespectful. Well, to who and why? I mean, we don't do that because we've never done that. Right? And so what would it look like if we did some things that we have never done before? Right? And so we may come back to some of that if we have time. All right. So I'm a big believer in after we figure out what we believe, now what? Marzano says every school should have an instructional model. So, put another way, if I were to ask you, or someone were to ask you, what is the instructional model at your school? Do you have one? What is your answer? Right? And this isn't meant to, well, for people to get defensive. Well, we've got an instructional model, So, is there something, let's kind of dig into that, is there something that if I walked into your classrooms, every single classroom, teachers are teaching in a similar fashion. They're using the similar instructional model. Now, a lot of people want to talk about, and this is just me talking at this point, this is what I believe, right? A lot of people want to say, well, we're using the 9 high-yield strategies. That was big in Rogers for a little while. All right, we're going to use Marzano's high-yield strategies. And I would challenge us to say that the high-yield strategies are an instructional model. I don't think they are, right? I think they are strategies within an instructional model. If you look at the root of how those strategies came about, they came about in specific instructional models. And a lot of times as teachers, we want to go, well, this is going to help a kid, so I'm going to use it. Right? Or this is going to help a kid, so I'm going to pick this, and I'm going to cherry pick this. And that's a way, right? But I might argue that it's not the way that's going to pay off the most dividends later on. Okay? So I'm going to challenge you, if you haven't really thought about it, principals in particular, what is the instructional model in your building? You could, I've got a very wise, very good friend of mine. I think she's one of the best educators I've ever come across. Her instructional model that she believes in wholeheartedly is Kagan. That's a great instructional model. It does a lot of the things that we're going to do in PBL. Okay, it has structures for that. So maybe your building model is Kagan. That's fantastic, right? So how do you do some of the things that we're going to challenge maybe you to do in a Kagan model? For us, it's project-based learning, right? For us, it's project-based learning, and a very specific model that we have adopted, that we have morphed, that we have helped along in its evolution to help us accomplish the things that we wanted to accomplish. So for us, this PBL model, project-based learning model, with some non-negotiables is our instructional model. What that means to me is, I could take you to any classroom in our building, humanities, math, any of the core, any of the electives, PE, health, and we're teaching using our project-based model. Okay? And there are some specific pieces to that. So I kind of jumped ahead here. This is our piece. Now, within our PBL model, there are 3 things that we talk about, or that I would bring your attention to. The first is teaching that engages. So we've got we have non-negotiables, we have pieces within our model where if you're going to teach a class in biology, or you're going to teach a class in English 1, these are the things we're going to take you through. These are the non-negotiables that we're going to utilize. Okay? They're not on the screen yet, but we'll kind of talk about it, right? Those are that if you're going to do that, you're going to do it this way. When I came into education in the 90s, they were doing the whole, you got to put I went through the University of Kansas. The way they trained us, you walk in the classroom, you put your goal on the board, and it's in this model. The student will be able to. I don't know if any of you remember that, right? And then we got slick. What did we do? We truncated it to T, S, W, right? And then we just wrote it up there. And then we got even better. We didn't even put that. We just put the activity a lot of times, right? And so there were some non-negotiables that they wanted us to do when we were putting that objective on the board. And so we'll talk a little bit about what that looks like. We also want to do that in a culture that empowers kiddos, adults, right? I mean, that's who's in our building. We got kiddos and we got adults. So we want to do teaching. We want to engage kiddos with our teaching model in a culture that empowers them. That means kiddos have to be able to be part of the decision-making team. Right? And there has to be, as we kind of talked about this morning, there has to be some choice in there. Okay? And we'll kind of talk a little bit, if we come around to it, on what we find is kids don't necessarily just choose the easy option. Why? Because we're going to give them feedback on a bunch of different things. And when you give, typically, human nature is we want to be the best at what we do. Typically. Okay? And so when that happens, we're going to tap into that and we're going to say, you know what? Maybe you need to do a couple other things to get better at this particular skill set or that particular skill set. Okay? So teaching that engages, culture that empowers, technology that enables. So we are a one-to-one building. We have one device in the hands of every one of our kiddos. We let them take it home. It is theirs. I give it to them in August, and they do not give it back to me until May. Now, I am not a huge fan of Chromebooks. I don't use them. The reason I don't use them, I'll just be honest with you. I mean, I understand they're cheap. I understand they will do a lot of the stuff. I don't like them because I want these guys to be able to produce. I need a production device, right? Because we're doing projects for learning. And that sometimes that might be a paper we could do on Google, but it might not be. It might be using iMovie. It might be, using GarageBand. It might be, so I need them to have a device that has the capacity and the memory to be able to produce some kind of product. All right, so Todd, I'm going to turn this over to Todd. He's going to kind of take us through kind of the nuts and bolts of some of those non-negotiables we were talking about, and then we'll come back and kind of talk a little bit more global again. So Todd, they're all yours, man.
All right. Yeah, so Dr. Arbuckle already talked for a minute about agency, collaboration, some of those things that our students are being assessed on from really in every class on a day-to-day basis. And so what those are called technically is the school-wide learning outcomes. The new tech also will call it like the 5-category scoring rubric. But I wanted to just point this out for us because knowledge and thinking is one of those school-wide learning outcomes. And so our knowledge and thinking scores come from if you're in a biology class, those are your biology standards. If you're in, I teach AP US History, if you're in my AP US History class, it's US History standards. And so that's that content knowledge that all of us need to be teaching already. Oral communication and written communication are two other outcomes that we teach for and teach to. Is anyone in here a communication major? Anyone from college? Okay. So I just have to share this. Because I was a communication major, which is like basically the most broad major you could possibly have. And I remember as I was getting ready to graduate, everyone was like, what are we going to do with this degree? It's like the broadest degree in the history of the world. And so there was one point we were talking to our department, and we were like, what kind of jobs can we do if we're a communication major? And our department was like, our dean was up there. No. Communication majors can do whatever they want. And we were like, that's awesome. So like, what are some examples? The sky's the limit. If you're a communication major, yeah, and they just kept the general statement after general statement. But finally what they came to is, it doesn't matter if you're the brightest nuclear physicist in the history of the world. If you can't communicate what you know to anyone, you're going to be ineffective. And so I've thought about that since I came to New Tech, Because really, oral comm and written comm are necessary whatever our students end up doing, whether that's going to college, whether that's going directly into the workforce, or that's going into the military. And so by focusing on those skills, we're preparing them for success wherever they find themselves. Collaboration is going to be pretty straightforward, and agency is what we'll dig into a little bit more, since we're not going to have time to really dig into each of these categories or these outcomes. We're going to really take a peek into agency so you can see what that looks like. Whenever I first started, I remember learning about the agency outcome and being like, oh my gosh, this is so great, because it's all about taking the initiative, taking ownership over your learning, and taking empowering yourself to tackle things that you don't know and challenge yourself. And I remember thinking, oh my goodness, agency is just life. It's life. And I had a co-teacher at the time. One day I came in and was like, I had this epiphany. Man, agency is life. It's like, you're so right. And we taught ninth graders at the time. I remember we got them like, guys, agency is life. And then it turns out you have to be a little bit more specific. Like, that's a little more helpful if you go a little bit deeper than like, it's life. Because our ninth graders looked at us like we were crazy. So, agency, if we're looking for a better definition for it, or a little more specific definition, it challenges students to consistently take charge of their learning by thinking and reflecting on their own processes. And you might peek at what some of these skills are underneath, because each one of these skills has a rubric that we assess our students on. And so, I think anyone can look at that list and be like, oh my gosh, that's good. Like, seeking challenge. Everybody would want their high school students or their middle school students to be like, yeah, I want to challenge myself. Growing from setbacks, oh my goodness. We could value overcoming or bouncing back from failure. I think everybody in this room, like, that's an excellent skill. But as you go through it, you're going to see things like building confidence, finding personal relevance, using effort and practice to grow. You might see some of those and be like, okay, how the heck do you assess that? Like, I always think finding personal relevance is really important, right? But how do you assess that? Because I can't sit back across the room and be like, all right, today I'm grading finding personal relevance. Doesn't got it, they do, they don't. All right, now let's move on, right? Like, it doesn't work that way. That's such a, it's really something that's happening in their head, and you've got to watch for those signs that they're grasping. And so we've got a couple rubrics that I want to put up just so we can cover.
Well, so let's go back to what we heard this morning, right? I mean, where Nottingham was talking about, we're saying the same thing, we're using different language, right? That's what we're doing here. We're saying the same things. When you start thinking about seeking challenge, one of the things he asked, how do you get kids to take the challenging side of the path and not the easy side, right? Well, you're going to tell them that's part of the assignment. I mean, this is it. You need to challenge yourself. Now, here's the piece that I think is important, because we might look at the left side of his screen, remember the easy path, and it's easy, but it may not be easy for every kid, right? It may be hard for some kids, the easy path. And so, that's where I think a lot of times we might lose kids, where they're like, okay, well, you're saying that's easy, but I look at that overgrown, but that's going to be hard for me already, right? Because I don't know what that. So something like this, a model like this might, and not that one's better than the other, but I like what it gives us is it allows us to respond to the individual needs of kids. What I talk about a lot of times with our parents is we are going to personalize and customize the educational experience for your kiddo. It's things like this that allow that to happen.
Yeah, no, and we're not digging into the collaboration rubric, but one of the first, instances in my teaching career at New Tech where I was like, this is really good. We get a broad range of students, but one kind of student that we can get is the student that when they were in 8th grade, give them whatever assignment they need to do, and they're going to knock that assignment out. They're going to be just fine. That is like, you guys have seen that student. You teach 9th graders. And I'll never forget, we had this girl, and she came from middle school, and we're in the very first project in my humanities class, and she came up to me like week 2 and was like, let me see something I got to talk to you. So go out all day. And if you teach at New Tech, you have these conversations a lot. If you teach 9th grade, she's like, Johnny and Rachel are not doing any work. And I was like, oh gosh, that's great. That's not fun. what did Johnny and Rachel say when you talked about this? And she goes, I didn't. What did you do? I came to talk to you. And I remember thinking, for that girl, as a 9th grader, as a 14-year-old, she gets to start working on that skill set, that collaboration skill set about how do I harness the energy of a group and work towards a common goal. And by the way, I don't know that I really started to work on that skill set until I was like in my mid-20s. So she's got a 10-year head start on me, right? And so that's the power, is that we are able to focus on those things whenever we prioritize them the way that we do. So just to give you an idea of what some of these rubrics might look like, these are just 2 that we'll put up. If you wanted to see these, you can just Google these. You could Google New Tech Network Agency Rubrics, and you could see that long list of skills that fall underneath that agency umbrella. If you wanted to look at the collaboration rubrics, you could Google New Tech Network Collaboration Rubrics, and you're going to find them. I think there are skills that we assess that when I brag to my friends that don't teach, like one of the collaboration standards is contributing to the group generation of ideas. Like, is that not what happens in the work world? You have a bunch of people in a room, and you got to figure out how to solve problems, how to move forward, how to make your business succeed, or whatever it is that you're doing. And so we're practicing that stuff, and we're teaching for that stuff whenever we have these high school students. And if you do what I do, whenever you see a rubric, your eyes might go directly to the proficient column for finding personal relevance. Often finds personal relevance in the work by connecting it to interest or goals, reflecting on progress towards mastery, or identifying autonomous choices. And so, what does that look like? Well, at the beginning of a project, we're going to see this rubric. We're going to be able to put this in front of our students so that they're able to consciously think about, what does it look like for me to find personal relevance in the work that I'm doing? And then what does assessment look like? Well, it's almost like you got a semester-long version of like the clipboard thing. And we've all done the clipboard thing's great, right? Where you sit on the side of the room and you start making notes on how people are doing. Like, if you've got this standard out there, I want to watch for instances where students are finding personal relevance in their work, then all of a sudden everything becomes fair game. So I'll give you some examples from my class, teaching U.S. history, where I've been like, okay, they got it. I had a student a few years ago. We were working on a project called, some of you guys might know, the History Channel has this Men Who Built America series. And they have like the Food Who Built America, I think. They're really all over the place. One thing that I think is interesting is there's no Women Who Built America yet. And so we have a project called The Women Who Built America. And it's all about the suffragettes and everything. And I had a student once who, on a Saturday night at like 10:30 at night, I'd gotten an email from her that was like, I was just watching this other show about Susan B. Anthony, and I didn't know this, but we were just talking about this. And like, she's like making connections between what she did on a Saturday night and what we were talking about in my class on a Friday. And so those are the types of things, like making connections to interest or goals. I'm going to come back and be like, okay, she's showing that. Like the first interview I ever had for a teaching job was at Rainey Junior High. I'm sure I didn't get many questions right. But one of them that I think I did get right, even to this day, is they said, how do you know whenever kids learn something? And I said, if I pop out in the hallway and I hear them talking to their friends about it outside of class, then I can feel pretty good that landed, right? And that's what finding that personal relevance is. I had a student that showed up on Monday morning this week who was like, she was like, can you grade my writing assignment? Because I haven't graded it yet. She turned it in late, so yeah, show a little bit of and she was like, can you grade my writing assignment? She said, I was really struggling because she was researching a colony. She was researching Jamestown. And she was like, yeah, I was really confused because I found this website that said there were a lot of women there early on, but then I found this other website that said there weren't. And then I looked at a few other websites, and all of them were saying that women showed up a little bit later. Well, there are a lot of people that if they had to find one resource for Jamestown, they might have found that one resource and like, there were a lot of women in Jamestown in 1607 or whatever it was. And she didn't. She kept going, and then not only that, she came in that morning and was like talking about a research process. Well, that's finding personal relevance. And so there are those instances like that where now I almost look at it like, it's not like you're rewarding kids for what they did, but you're getting to say, hey, that skill, what you did on Monday morning when you came in to talk to me about your research, that is a really important thing, right? It's not just this secondary consideration. Like, that's going to point you in a really good direction. You're going to do really good things in life if that's something you keep driving towards. But then the other piece of that is, and we're going to talk more about it, is that metacognitive reflection piece, right? And so whether it's goal setting or anything like that at the beginning of a project, and then at the end being able to say, all right, how did we do? And you can put these rubrics in front of them. You can do some honest self-reflection, and we'll talk about that more, but that's how you can kind of target these things.
Yeah, and I want to camp out here for a minute, and let's just think about the number of directions that we can go with something like this, right? So first of all, let's come back to, how do we scaffold for helping a kid find personal relevance? Well, it's within the rubric, right? So did you, if I'm having that conversation with a kiddo, okay, tell me about your goals. Tell me about I know this is kind of it's sort of not necessarily organic right now. Probably have it a different way, that conversation with that kiddo. But in essence, it's like, tell me your goals. Or I know you've talked about, this in the past, and how would you connect the work that we're doing right now to that? Or, I know you're really interested in like the women's movement, right? And so suffrage, and how would you connect that? Can you connect that, right? And so you take a little bit of time, and now all of a sudden you have within here maybe I can think of 3 different ways just within that top one, where if we're just trying to help a kiddo get to proficient, we might be able to take them down a path of finding personal relevance. Okay, you can do that same thing using effort and practice to grow. Okay, by asking them questions and taking them back to the rubric, because that's the power of that. Now, the other piece for the principals in the room or teacher leaders, right? We had some conversations. I don't know. We probably started those conversations 5 or 6 years ago. Maybe even we probably had the beginnings of those conversations when we started our building in 2013 on this path. Is what is a grade? Right? Let's go back to Nottingham stuff that he talked about. What is a grade? Well, it should be what they know and are able to do. Right? That's a kind of a low-hanging fruit answer. Fantastic. Right? If we're still, like at the high school level, if we're still given, half a grade for a kiddo because they didn't turn it in on Friday and they turned it in on Monday, does that grade really reflect what they know and are able to do? Right? Well, I would say no. Well, but I'm teaching responsibility. Well, are you teaching or are you assessing responsibility? There is a responsibility piece to the rubric. How would we scaffold for that? Right? Oh, or by the way, let's put the grade, we give grades for agency. Right? So we literally tell kids, here is your grade. It's a C, a D, an A for agency. Now, if you do that, and this is a conversation I have with parents, because we give a grade for every school-wide learning outcome, right? There's a grade for agency, there's a grade for oral comm, there's a grade for written comm, there's a grade for knowledge and thinking, there's a grade for collaboration. Okay, and we report those grades to parents. So as a parent, if you have kiddos, I have 2 of them, they've both gone through New Tech, right? When I look at their grade and it says they have A's across the board, except in agency they have a D, right? What's my conversation with them as a parent? Should it be, you need to study more. You need to know more about American history. Get that grade up. No, because the grade is about finding personal relevance and all those things that we just talked about. Right? So now your conversation as a parent gets to be a little deeper. Right? I notice you've got A's across the board, but you've got a D in agency. Tell me about that. Well, I didn't get my work turned in on time. Great, let me help you fix that, right? Which is a very different conversation than you need to get in your room and study some more. Getting in your room and studying some more does not help turning in stuff on time. You follow me? So there's a lot of power in the rubric. Then all of a sudden, this is where we get to, then all of a sudden, I can give a grade for each one of those individual line items. And if the power, something else I believe, I didn't put it up there, right? I believe that learning is what's valuable. Not learning when I tell you to learn, but learning, right? So I believe it's just as valuable if let's say a kid learns something in October, because that's when we teach that standard. Say Todd's teaching that standard in October. We've got 2 kids. One learns it in October. The other one, it takes him a little longer, and he doesn't get it until the 1st of December. Should their grades be the same? I think the answer is yes. Why? Because they learned it. Right? Now, maybe the agency is a little different because maybe they didn't learn it. Or maybe, right, the kiddos were different and it just took the second kiddo a little longer. That's okay, because what's most valuable? That they learned it. You see where I'm going? Now all of a sudden the rubrics give you that kind of power. So.
Yeah, I know whenever I went through high school, and probably most of us experienced this, like the nice or forgiving teachers were the one that would be like, hey, if it's a day late, it's 10% off. If it's 2 days late, it's 20% off, or something like that. Well, that is like an attempt at baking in some form of teaching responsibility, but really it's assessing responsibility. And what this does is it gives us the ability to really parse out those skills. One skill is understanding U.S. history, or writing an argument, or understanding quadratic functions, or whatever. The other skill is doing things on time. And when you have a rubric for each of those things, it enables you to have much richer conversations involving student growth. And so that's really an extra bonus.
Yeah, and the last thing I'll say about this on this point is a lot of my colleagues in the past have said, well, when they get to the University of Arkansas, that won't be allowed. Well, I got one at the University of Arkansas. Guess what? It's allowed. How do I know? Because, and my son he's very good. I mean, he got a nice high score on the ACT, so it helped me out financially. He's in the honors college. He's a double major plus a minor in history, poli-sci. He loves elections. He reads all kinds of stuff, but he gets all knotted up sometimes, right? You know what I mean? I mean, he gets all like, oh, Dad, I got this thing I got to do, and I waited too long, and I didn't get enough studying done. And I'm like, well, what do you do? The first time was, I don't know, what should I do? Well, have you tried to communicate with your professor? Maybe you send him an email. Guess what? He sent him an email. Hey, I'm really sorry. I'm working on this. I probably didn't do what I needed to do, but I'll get it in 2 days. Guess what the professor said? Thanks for letting me know. Turn it in when you're ready. Right? Now, that's not a bite at the apple you want to take all the time with that professor. Right? But what they figured out, remember I put assertiveness up there at the ASU? If you're assertive and you communicate with your professor that, hey, life's happening to me, maybe I had a flat tire, I was in a car accident, maybe I just didn't do what I was supposed to, but I'll get it in tomorrow. My experience with my own son at the University of Arkansas is hey, I understand that. You get that in. You know why? Because they're not grading it when they turn it in the first time anyway. Right? So, is it more valuable? Here's what this is what I wrestle with. Is it more valuable to tell those kids, hey, you have to get it done on time and turn it in, otherwise it's a 0, or is it going to be more beneficial in the end to say, you know what? Let's teach them a skill where they have the assertiveness to communicate with the professor or their boss. Right? Hey, this is what's going on with me right now. Can I get a little grace? That's basically what it is. Right? And who in the room hasn't needed a little grace sometimes? Right? But how many kiddos do we have who are like, well, I can't do that. That's scary. Right? I can't, just like that little freshman girl. Well, I can't have a conversation with them about not doing their work. I mean, that's what you're here for. Right? How many of us have adults in our lives that can't have crucial conversations with each other? You see where I'm going? That's the power there. All right. I'm gonna keep
Yep. No, that's right. So just to give you a bigger picture of what all those skills are, if you look at the school-wide learning outcomes, those are like the umbrellas that encompass a lot of different skills. There are a ton of them. We'll just So clarity of tasks, making sure you can identify what needs to be done, being aware of how your team is performing. Everyone's got a story of being in a group project where I remember I was in a sociology class in college where we had to write group papers, and that turned into two guys sitting on the side of me while I typed and then going, yeah, that was good too. That happens, and so being able to be aware of how your team works and whether or not you're accomplishing the task put out in front of you, being able to have productive conversations, there's just a ton. And so there are nearly 50, different skills underneath those school-wide learning outcomes that we teach, just to ease your mind a little bit that it's not like we have all our content standards and every teacher does every single school-wide learning outcome. We've divided these up on a department level so that different grade levels are more intentional with different standards. And so what we can guarantee is that anyone that comes through our building, by the time they graduate, they've had experience being taught these different skills, having teachers that have scaffolded for these skills and helped them develop them and been assessed in them. So no one's going to graduate and be like, finding personal relevance, what's that? Like they're going to get that in multiple classes, just not in every single class.
Yeah, and the reality is that when we start talking about essential standards, right? I mean, because I'm a big one on that too. You have to look at it from the standpoint of there are essential knowledge and thinking standards, content standards that I need to do in American history, in biology. Now, because we have adopted PBL, and I'm just going to tell you from experience, you cannot cover the same amount of content in PBL that you cover in a traditional classroom. Okay? I use this term, it's not a judgmental term, but when you have a classroom that is teacher-centric, right? Meaning the teacher is going to decide what the content is, the teacher is going to deliver that content, kids are going to be consumers of that content, and we're using good, effective strategies even inside that teacher-led classroom, okay? You are going to get through content more quickly than if it's in a PBL classroom. And I would argue, and maybe he said it, you're going to get through content more quickly in that teacher-led classroom than you will in the classroom with the learning pit. Because when you take time, it takes time to let kids wallow in the productive struggle. That's the term I use, right? When they wallow in the productive struggle a little bit, and the hardest part, and Todd he can support this, the hardest part about being a teacher in this model, in the PBL model, is when you hear kids struggling, you want to go say, this is how that is. Right? You do this, you do that. Okay? But you got to let them work through it. And eventually they're either going to get it or they're going to say, Mr. Simpson, you're going to have to come straighten this out because we don't get it. Now what? Now you have permission to be a tool. They've asked for you as a tool. Hey, we need you. They could have gone to Google. They could have gone to, what's the Khan Academy, right? They could have gone to lots of places, but they chose you. Congratulations, by the way, right? They chose you to say, hey, we need some help with this. All right? So one of the things, as Todd's talking about, one of the things we've done to help with that is we've said, here are the agency standards that we're going to work on in 9th grade. There are 13 agency standards. You probably counted, if you counted them, there's 13. I think there's 4 that we use in 9th grade, 4 or 5. Then there's 4 or 5 we're going to use in 10th grade. You see where I'm going? And then a couple more in the 11th grade and a couple more in the 12th grade. To help with that, because it becomes very overwhelming, right, to think about, well, I'm going to do 50. You're going to do 50, but over the course of a 4-year experience. I also think about these kiddos' experience with us as a 4-year experience. It's not a 9th grade or a 10th grade or an 11th grade or a 12th grade experience. It's a new tech experience, if you will. Okay?
All right. Okay, so This is, we're getting a little bit into the structure now. I had a friend that used to call, when you set up projects, he called it the learning machine. He was going to be like, all right, how's the learning machine doing? It's a wooden desk.
Yeah.
And so what are those non-negotiable pieces that fit into our instructional model that are going to be in every classroom, in every project? And so this is really going to be like the view from, 15,000 feet? Like we're gonna move quickly through them. But I know our contact information's at the end, so if there were any questions, we're always happy to answer them. But every project at New Tech begins with what we call an entry event. And you talk about teaching that engages. That's what this is. The entry event is our way of capturing those students before we ever get into the content. Because when we, we had another teacher who teaches in Massachusetts now. He used to always talk about, we spend a lot of time at New Tech being like, why would a high schooler care about blank? Why would they care about quadratic functions? Why would they care about the War of 1812? Why would they care about citing their sources? Like figuring out the why that can engage our students. And so the entry event really is the beginning of like a project framework, and it's going to be something that's either authentic to the real world or authentic to students' lives that they care about and they connect to it. So to give you a couple examples, we have a pre-AP calculus teacher who, and the math principle I'm going to get wrong. So I'm just going to say quadratic functions because I've said that like 3 times and I know that's a thing, right? Okay, so there's something like quadratic functions. And the way that he wanted to teach it is something to do with blood pressure. Because blood pressure readings really worked out as whatever this math principle was. And he worked out with the anatomy and physiology teacher, who they were also doing something with blood pressure. And for his entry event, he brought in all the anatomy and physiology kids to they had cuffs and they took blood pressure readings from his pre-AP calculus class. And then those readings formed the data set for that project to see how these functions played out. They're actually doing it right now. One of our 9th grade humanities blocks, they're getting ready to teach Lord of the Flies. And for their entry event, when kids walked in, there was the whole room is transformed into a deserted island. There's palm tree cutouts and everything. And their entry event was a video where the 2 facilitators are flying along in a plane, and it's cheesy as all get out.
They're flying sideways.
They're flying sideways.
Literally.
The sky is moving this way in their videos. So they're flying along, and they're talking about how great it is, and then the plane starts going down, and they write a message really quickly, and they throw it out of the plane, and then they crash, and there's a model plane that goes down. And the kids then get the entry document. So the entry event is really the avenue for this entry document, which sets out the whole project, right? So in that case, the entry document was a letter from their facilitators being help, we're trapped on a deserted island. We need to figure out how to build a new society from the ground up with laws and everything like that. Well, it's an intro to Lord of the Flies. That's what happens on the island. They took the main theme of Lord of the Flies and turned it into this framework. And then throughout this project, the kids are going to come in, and that's what they're trying to do. They're trying to help their facilitators who are stuck on this deserted island. And there's something about how that they were going to pretend to be holograms while in class. It didn't make sense, but that's okay. Kids don't care if it makes sense, I promise. They really want to humiliate yourself. And so their entry document turns into this letter, right? In some cases, what the entry document looks like might be like a memo from an elected official. Or we had a science class where their entry document was from Elon Musk, who was wanting their class to develop a new landing pad for SpaceX rocket. And that was their way of teaching ideal gas law. And so it's like an email thread that these students have to go through and read and figure out what they've got to do. And so we've talked a lot about thinking strategically. Really, what this entry document does, it serves as the breadcrumbs, right? It doesn't come with a nice bulleted list of step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, step 5. It comes like problems in the real world come to us, right? Whether it's an email, or whether it's a letter, or whether it's a tweet, or whatever it is. And students have to sort through that and come up with a plan to execute. So, the way we do that is through this process called knows, need to knows, and next steps. So they get this document in front of them. Everything's kind of buried in there. There could be vocabulary they need. The final product's buried in there somewhere. And they've got to sift through this and figure out what needs to be done. My wife works in operations, and one of the greatest compliments she can give somebody is that they have the ability to think strategically. And so I still remember her being like, well, she was talking about someone else who's like, they don't know how to think strategically. And I was like, what does that mean? She's like, well, they just sit around and wait for someone to tell them what to do. And all I could think about was like, is that why you had to ask me to pick my shoes up out of the middle of the living room all the time? But like, she wants people to be able to think for themselves, right? They want to be able to see the problem and solve it, and not wait for my wife or someone else to come to them and be like, hey, did you get this done? Hey, this is how you should solve this. The problem is that in high school, it takes time. You have to create margin in the work that we do for students to be able to practice thinking strategically. And so this need to knows, next steps process is really the greatest avenue to say, what's the problem? How do we get to the end of it? What do we need to make? How do we get there? And so they take that email or that letter from their facilitators who are stuck on the deserted island, or the memo from an elected official, or the letter from HBO. I mean, I could go down the list forever and ever. They take that and they identify first what they know. And the no's are usually something like, we know that it's going to be due on November 8th. We know that we're going to have to look at the women's suffrage movement. We know that we've got to edit a video or something like that, right? And so they've got this column of no's. And then the need to knows are like, that's like the money-making area, right? This is the spot that I spend the most time on because I think it's the coolest part. And this is where they look at that document and they say, what are the questions? What do we need to know? This is where they get to identify the problem. And so if you were doing a project on the women's suffrage movement, you would drop breadcrumbs in there as the teacher, like Alice Paul, 19th Amendment, Woodrow Wilson. And your students who've been doing this and got pretty good at it might say, hopefully would say, I have no idea who Alice Paul is. I think I need to know who Alice Paul is. I don't know what the 19th Amendment is. I need to know what the 19th Amendment is. Maybe they have no idea how to edit a video. Maybe that's the problem. They say, I think we need to figure out how to edit a video. That sounds complicated. That probably wouldn't be our kids anymore. I feel like that's like a 10 years ago problem. But, that's where they start diagnosing what are the things that they need to solve. One of the issues that you might find is you really want to make sure that you're pushing them deeper with these need to knows, because sometimes they need some scaffolding to get there, right? We want to cultivate that skill set to think strategically. And so, when we give them this need to knows process, we need to help push them a little bit deeper. And so we've got this thing called layering the need to knows process. And I think Anna Claire's probably seen this a time or two in my class. I think you've probably led this a time or two, actually, in my class. But I won't go through this totally, but I did want to put this up there to show you how we make sure that they're really getting to the root of what that entry document is asking of them. What's that final product that they need? What's the problem they need to solve? And how do they make sure they can actually strategize and prioritize steps to get there? So we put the entry document in front of them, and they come up with their need to knows, next steps in their groups. And that could be, a whole page long. It might be 6 or 7, whatever it is. What we want to start to do is filter through those. And so once they've got their need to knows down, a lot of times what we'll say is, all right, talk in your groups. Figure out what your 5 most important are. And so you then start to filter the first list down to the 5 most important. Eventually you take those 5 most important from every group and you build this big group list or class list on the board of everything that they need to figure out in the course of this project. And so now what you've got is the best need to knows from 25, 22, however many kids are in your class on the board. And once you've got to that point, this is my favorite part, honestly, is then say, okay, let's organize these in the order that they need to be approached. Like, you just came up with everything that we could possibly get out of this entry document. Now, how do we need to actually work through this project? And you, me, you might have an idea in your mind of like, this is what, I know what they're going to pick first. And sometimes you're going to be right. Sometimes they're going to say something different. And that's okay. Because remember, we're like creating margin for them to chart the path through this project. There have definitely been times, I think it happened last year, where I was like, we were doing some project with World War I, and I was like, oh yeah, I'll probably have to do some sort of workshop on the cause of World War I, but it'll be about a week and a half out. And then when they did this process, they were like, I think we need a workshop on World War I tomorrow. And I was like, you sure? Yeah. All right. So I gotta make this workshop. Like, that happens, but what you've done is you've empowered them. Like, it's them guiding the ship through. Eventually you take those need-to-knows that they put in order, you throw some cognitive action verbs on there, so it's something that you can really check off, whether it's like identify the causes of World War I, or whether it's define ideal gas law, or whatever that need-to-know is, you transform that into a next step. And I'm a huge, huge fan of to-do lists. I think until I figured out the secret of to-do lists, I don't think I was ever very productive. And so what the next steps turn into is literally a to-do list that they came up with for this 3-week, 4-week project that then you can work through. And every couple days you can come back to and say, we did this. Are we still on the right track? Do you think we're in a good spot to move on to step 2? Do you think we're in a good spot to move on to step 3? And it's their plan. And it turns out that changes everything. You might still be doing the same things, right? You might still have workshops on the same things you would have done a workshop on if you'd come up with it. But if it's their plan, engagement changes. Eventually it all culminates with final presentations. And this is not like, you don't do the learning and then reward yourself with the final presentations. It's not like we did blank, 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 and now we put it all together. Like, you're always working towards this end point. And because of that, that's how you fill in the gaps to get there. And it's from that plan that they come up with. And sometimes it's delivered to the faculty, like this group did here, when they presented to us at the beginning of the school year. Sometimes it's delivered to someone from the Rogers Chamber of Commerce. Sometimes it's someone from a company, like Nabholz Construction. Sometimes it's to a panel of their peers. Sometimes, it's just that audience at the end is where everything comes together, and it's kind of I won't say the end part of the project, because Dr. Arbog is going to talk about really the next phase of it, but it's really the celebration, I think, of the end point.
Yeah, and this is really an opportunity to, remember I said at the beginning, you want to extend the culture that empowers out of the 4 walls of the classroom. So this is where administrators really support this. So this group was tasked with designing the first 3 days of school. And they spent all summer working on it, and this is them giving that plan to the teachers. Right? A couple of things that does. One, it allows kids to exercise that skill set in other areas outside of academic. 2, it makes it a little easier on the facilitator, on the teachers, because now they're not planning the first 3 days of school. Right? So if you go back to your staff and you go, guys, we got 3 days of school, we're not going to plan it, kids are going to plan it, and it's going to be really good, and it was, by the way, then there's some relief on that end too, so there's some value on that. Okay, reflection is a big piece to this. Okay? Got to reflect. And you're reflecting in the middle, at the beginning, you're reflecting in the middle, you're reflecting at the end, you're reflecting after the end product, and we were very specific on these 2 kinds of pictures, because if you will watch an NFL ball game, a college ball game going on, what happens? The offense comes off the field, and when they show those guys sitting on the sideline, what are they doing? They're looking at all the plays they just ran. And they're like, hey, we should have done this better. We can do this better next time. Why? Because they're going to go in again in 2 or 3 minutes of gameplay, right? My wife's like, yeah, that's 20 minutes of real time. I get it, but in 2 minutes, they're going to go back in, and they're going to play some more, and they want to do a better job during the next offensive set than they did the last offensive set. So they got to reflect, and they've got to learn. You see where that's going? Okay? So kiddos are doing that same thing. You're using the rubric to help them reflect on the work that they've done to that point. All right, so this is the part that I always think, okay, when I'm sitting in a session, how do I apply this to my building? Like, what do I need to do? What are my next steps? Right? Well, the first thing I would tell you to do is we need to have a building-wide understanding of why we're doing the work. And, well, to teach kids, I'll be honest with you, anybody can teach kids. That's not why we do the work. Why we do the work is we're turning 14-year-olds into adults. Nobody else can do that the way we do it, right? That's the way I look at it. So why are we doing what we're doing? And by the way, I've got this railroad track. I like the railroad track model. Content and skills only work when there is a co-equal, when there's that marriage of equals, right? You think about a train running down the track. If one side of the track is bumpy or one side of the track is missing, will the train run? No, it won't. Right? So both sides, you've got to pay attention. You've got to give attention to both sides of the track. An instructional model that reflects the items that are important to you as educators and your community, whether it's your learning community or your larger geographic community. A clear commitment to fully fulfilling that instructional model. Basically, if you're going to say these are non-negotiables, if an entry event is non-negotiable, an entry doc is non-negotiable, no's, need to knows are non-negotiable, then we've got to have a full commitment that that's what's going to happen in every classroom. Guess what happens if you don't? Kids come and tell. Right? Kids come and tell. They say, hey, this isn't going on in this classroom. It happened to me on multiple occasions over my years. And by the way, they are much harder than a building principal is walking into a teacher's classroom. Right? Teachers get nervous when a principal walks in. What about when a kid is there and going, hey, you're not doing what we all agreed we were going to do? Accountability for everybody. That's one of the things I love about it. And then collecting and curating ongoing reflection and using that reflection. So basically, we need to make time. As Todd talked about, we've got to make time in the margins for those things that are really important. And kiddos reflecting on their work. That metacognitive piece is important, right? We reflect on our craft, do we not? When you get done with a lesson, you reflect on how'd that go. Did it go well? Did I like it? I'm going to do something different. Why don't we give kids that same courtesy? Right? To reflect, we got to build in that time, just like you do. Okay? Last piece, we got 2.5 minutes. So if there's any questions, basically this is our contact information. You are welcome to email us. My Twitter account there, Arbuckle73. The school Twilter account. Apparently we have a new social media called Twilter. So the school Twilter account is at RogersNTHS. If you're into Twitter at all. We do have a Facebook page. We kind of keep that up and running, but I'm more of a Twitter person myself. Any questions? We kind of burned through a lot of stuff. We're going to be in this room again. We've got kiddos, and they know that all questions are fair game for them. They're asking, hey, what question are they going to ask? I have no idea. Right? And so we'll be glad to answer any questions in that next session as well. So thanks for coming. I appreciate it. And we'll set up the next one.